Hello, today we're working with Unit 6, linking clauses from grammar and vocabulary. We're on page 100. Remember, the entry test gives you a glimpse of what you're going to see throughout the unit, right? So uses of so and such at the beginning, that call for inversion, despite, however, much as, even though, etc. You also see in activity 4, one of my favorite pet peeves, and that's why I wrote here pet peeve. Right, if we look this up, the dictionary takes you actually to the words with hate, because in British English you speak of somebody's pet hate, in American English pet peeve, right? Something you particularly dislike. And it's not that I dislike the use of for all in activity 4, sentence A. For all her lines and wrinkles, she looks really good. And this for all is usually mistranslated as por todo, right? Literally. But it means simply, quite simply, despite. So this time I have no comments about the basics, right? So we'll go directly to section 1. And in section 1, in the column on the left, we're going to focus on these time clauses, but in particular, we're going to focus on actually sequence of events. We're going to look at the second bullet point here, and you will find expressions like as soon as, once, after, and the next bullet point on, hardly, immediately, the moment, and no sooner. In all of these cases, in all of these sentences, except for one actually, but we'll see why, we use the past perfect and the simple past, because these clauses are used to show the fact that two actions are practically simultaneous, right? One right after the other one, and that's why I need to to draw a distinction between the two actions and to use the past perfect for the one that came before, right? And that's why we say as soon as she had finished, once she had her bath, after she had waited. On phoning, there's no past perfect, but simply because on is a preposition and calls for the participle, right, on phoning. But in this case, we could also have said after she had phone reception, right? She had hardly put down when. This will actually come back again in Unit 7, Section 2, when we start talking about inversion again, right? And remember that hardly occurs with when. Immediately, or the moment he had finished. And let's pay attention to the last one. She'd no sooner switched on the TV than there was an enormous explosion. What about this she'd no sooner? Be careful. This is the past perfect. She had no sooner switched on the TV, right? So this means right after she switched on the TV. Why do I stop here? Because we usually use sooner with would and would say I'd sooner do something. I'd, right? In that case, the D is I would sooner, right? Okay, I realized I skipped one little thing, which is the use of whilst here in the second bullet point. Whilst she waited for the bath to fill. Whilst is a simply more formal way of saying while, right? Okay, next column. Next column, we're going to have a look at the expression seeing that. We are agreed for two reasons. One, seeing that, maybe that's not very familiar. It just means because, right? Seeing that. Maybe this has an entry here. Now, there's nothing odd about seeing that. It's just that it is a little, well, I don't know where the dictionary took us, but it's not where we wanted to go, right? See for yourself, seeing that. Let's see, Control F, seeing that. Yes, no, that's another case, right? There it is, that's why. It was at the bottom. Seeing that. Now, thank you, dictionary, because also we use this informally with seeing as how, right? This is very informal. Seeing that he's been off sick all week, he's unlikely to come, meaning simply because, right? if we analyze the fact that, if we take into account the fact that. But remember that this seen as how is informal. Now, the next point I wanted to make here is we are agreed, right? Which is something you're not used to saying, right? Because the verb agree actually is never used with the verb to be. Now, in this very particular case, right, we use are simply because we're using it in a more formal way, right? To be, it is less, much less frequent, right? No, there isn't a case here. There should be. No, there isn't a collocation. Well, it doesn't matter. Just note that to be agreed is something much less frequent, and we use it very frequently with the first person plural. We are agreed, right? Okay. The next category is insofar as and inasmuch as. I want to show you that the styling of insofar as is actually as separate words, right? In, so, or as, far as, and also as one word, insofar as, right? Now, the difference between insofar as and inasmuch as, which can also be spelled or styled as one word, inasmuch, or in as much as, well, it isn't here, is something that can be sometimes problematic, right? The meaning is a bit confusing. So you will be getting a list of examples, not just for insofar as, in as much as, and also less that comes in the next section. Both of them mean because, right? That's the main reason, because of something. But they also have this idea of to the extent or the degree that, right? Let me see an example here. That's the truth insofar as I know it. So to the extent that I know something about something, that's a truth, right? Es muy parecido a ese en tanto y en cuanto, right? Porque it shows a little bit of quantity. Now, inasmuch as can also be used to mean since, right? So, for example, you say, this medicine should not be used for the relief of pain inasmuch as its analgesic value is slight. So it means in view of the fact that, or for the reason that, because, or since, right? Basically the two. But let's just say that we can use more frequently inasmuch as meaning since, and insofar as meaning to the extent that. However, you know what happens with language, people use it the way they want, and maybe you find both uses, right? I mean, both uses with both meanings. I should say that the examples are quite self-explanatory, and they're going to help a lot. So let's move into the practice section, and I want to single out from activity number 1 on examining, right? He realized that the ticket was for the next day. On examining meaning after he had examined, right? And from number 5 in activity 1, still, I'd no sooner taken my seat than the fire. I'd no sooner taken my seat than the fire alarm went off. To go off, yes, means to start suddenly. And once again, this I'd no sooner means I had no sooner, right? I will skip to the paraphrasing. Remember that both the activities and the example are always very helpful, right? In the example here, the training was pretty comprehensive insofar as it covered all the main techniques. Notice that we can say that this means since, and also to the extent that, right? Because there is an element of quantity here, right? Okay, couple of comments in number 4. It says this government is clearly ineffective. Government in English can agree in the singular or in the plural, right? So when you use these words, these collective nouns as singular with singular agreement, you usually see them as a unit, right? When you use a plural agreement, you see the collective noun as a group of people, separate identities. To be frank, it is a bit more frequent to find government in the plural in British English, right? Like also for football teams and so on. Okay, from activity 4, I want to single out something regarding language. In blank number 7, it says she pouted, knowing or realizing it was nowhere near as fluent as it had been. This expression nowhere near is a very useful one, very frequent in English. It will appear in Unit 7, Section 3. All right, Section 2. Now for section 2, we have the first example of so and such at the beginning of a sentence, right? And you know that when you use so and such, you should know from language 2, actually, this creates a knock-on effect and there is inversion, right? So you can say he was so fed up that he threatened to resign, or so disgusted were they, so fed up were they that they threatened to resign. Right? Now, what matters is that we use so with an adjective. So disgusted, so tired, so flabbergasted, so destroyed. And with such, we use the verb to be plus a noun. Such was our annoyance that. Yes, this is clearly more formal, right? This is obvious. But I want to comment on this. Sometimes we work a lot with these two structures and we just use the same adjective, and that's not always possible, right? You can say so tired was I that I stopped talking, or such was my tiredness that I stopped talking. That's very odd, isn't it? And you can't do it. You can still do it with tired, but can you do it with flabbergasted? So flabbergasted were the people that such were, sorry, such was their, no, impossible. So, well, that will depend on the adjective, right? But we do like to play around with these two words. And aside here, with so, we tend to use so very much in spoken English to mean very, and say, I was so tired, I was so happy, I was so confused. Be very careful, because that is a correlative conjunction that says, I was so tired that blah, 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 blah. Now, in spoken English, when we say the examples I give you, we mean very. I was very tired, I was very happy, I was very confused. But in writing, you cannot use so plus an adjective and not finish the sentence, right? So, be careful. If you want the spoken version of so, in writing, it is very, all right? Okay, the next point in section 2 that I want to discuss is in order that and so that. Maybe you're not familiar with in order that, but that's a formal way of saying in order to, right? The example, I've drawn a map for you in order that you can find the house, right? It's just formal. You don't need to learn these rules that appear here. Don't worry. But I also want to draw your attention to for fear of. For fear of, right? For fear of and lest, right? They just refer to things you want to avoid, right? Now, why do I want to show you the dictionary here? Because it says to avoid the danger of something happening. So the fear in for fear of is figurative. There isn't a real fear, right? So be careful not to translate the word fear as temor, though you may need to. It may apply in certain cases. It's not always the case, right? We spoke quietly for fear of waking the guards. No es que teníamos miedo de despertarlos, era para evitar que se despertaran, right? Simply to avoid something bad. Okay, so remember not to take fear at face value, right? Lest is much more formal. You have the example here. He locked his drawer lest somebody should look in it overnight. Now, lest once again means to prevent something from happening, the same idea. And we tend to use should, particularly with the third person singular, because lest calls for this subjunctive, right? I prefer, this is an example, right? I prefer a person or a man who acts decisively rather than one who hesitates, lest he be guilty of imprudence. Lest he be guilty of, right? So be careful with this lest, because it is followed by the subjunctive, that is to say, the verb in infinitive without to, right? Very tricky word. The meaning is quite straightforward, right? But we use a subjunctive, and we may use should as well, right? Here we have a box, an explanatory box, right? Lest anyone should doubt my story, right? Usually we insert should because lest he doubt is something that really jars with English ears, right? Okay, let's go to the activities for section 2. And to be frank, I have no comments. Only some comments on grammar. In activity 2, sentence number 4, they speak about shops long boarded up, to board up, tapiar, right, to cover with boards. And sentence 11, customers, take on extra staff. That means to employ, right? Okay. The paraphrases are self-explanatory, so unfortunately I don't have any comments. Maybe you have questions, right? Now we move on to section 3, and what I want to discuss here is the use of hard as they tried, for example, or difficult though it was, right? And this is, these are rather more complex ways of saying simply although they tried, although it was difficult, right? So these are more formal, right? As regards much as I detest the idea, please remember it's not as much as, right? We say much as I detest the idea. And once again, this means the same as although I detest the idea. And it is more formal, clearly. As regards in spite of and despite, be careful. I take it for granted that you know how to use them. Remember that despite can be followed by a noun, right? Despite the weather, despite the strike, despite my innermost desires. And the same happens with in spite of. So we can also use a verb in the ing form, right? Despite knowing, in spite of knowing. But remember that you can also use a verb, a finite, but you will need the fact that. So in spite of the fact that the price was very high, or despite the fact that she was feeling dreadful. So be careful, right? With those uses. From the second column, I only have to comment on he left me in the lurch, right? Which is an expression to mean he didn't tell me he wasn't coming, and I stood there waiting for him or her, right? Okay, I assume all the other connectors are connectors you know. And unfortunately, for the other activities, I don't have any comments, right? I think they're not very difficult. Just a couple of comments regarding vocabulary in activity 1. Sentence 1 says, I'm not working overtime. To work overtime or to do overtime es trabajar horas extras. Remember, in English, that is not extra hours, right? That's an invention in English. Now, for sentence number 9 in the same activity, it shouldn't affect an athlete's performance, whichever lane they are drawn in. Be careful. This is a very beautiful phrasal verb, to draw in. You say days are drawing in right now. They're becoming shorter, right? But that's not the meaning here. This is the meaning of draw, as in to choose in a draw. You know, when you take pieces of paper from a container, un sorteo, right? And this in refers to the lane in which they have been, in which they're supposed to be, right? The lane they have been assigned through a draw, right? Un sorteo, okay? All right, this is all from me. Of course, you will have your own questions. Thank you, bye.